A poverty grounded on the fact of the incarnation. The Word became flesh. This captured their religious imagination. The story of the Nativity, the Annunciation, the birth in a manger, the visit of the shepherds. These gospel descriptions, the infancy narratives, portrayed the Lord as a poor child, welcomed by other poor people, born among animals because there was no room for this poor family in the inn. Francis would later write that Jesus was born for us along the way. Could also be translated along the side of the road, indicating that right from his birth, the life of the Lord would be precarious and difficult. And Clare writes in regard to her sisters how they should think of their clothing. Remember, these were mostly noble women. That when they're thinking about how they should dress, what they should focus on is those swaddling clothes that wrapped Jesus in the manger. Something just to keep the straw off of him. Another aspect of the life of Jesus and his early disciples that struck both of them was the fact that they were pilgrims and strangers. People on the move. In his earlier rule, the version he thought he would get approved in 1221 when he was kind of giving Cardinal Ugolino a lecture, and no, it wasn't approved. It said that his brothers should travel through the world like pilgrims and strangers, quoting from, I think it's the second letter of Peter. He says that this was the way that Jesus and his earliest disciples lived. He writes, "He was a poor man and lived on alms, he and the Blessed Virgin and the disciples." In reading and hearing the gospel, what struck Francis so strongly was the movement of Jesus from place to place. The words about the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. This was a precarious life. He observes him being a guest, almost always a guest, in the home of Mary and Martha and Lazarus. He's with Simon the leper. He's in the house of Simon Peter when Peter's mother-in-law is ill. He's with Zacchaeus and his friends, in the company of Matthew and his tax collector buddies. Even at his last meal with his disciples, Jesus has to ask somebody else for a room in which they can eat the supper. Jesus relies on the alms of others, on their hospitality extended toward him as one would treat a pilgrim or a foreign visitor. That's the way Francis also wants to live. Certainly another piece of Franciscan spirituality that is emphasized in both the writings of Francis and Clare is the mystery of the cross. But the mystery of the cross not as a tale of suffering, but the mystery of the cross as a tale of love. Clare writes beautifully to her friend, her pen pal, Agnes of Prague up in Bohemia, about the life of Jesus by using the image of a mirror. Agnes was a princess of the royal family of Bohemia, and these two noble women knew about mirrors. Most people had never seen a mirror in their life. The mirror that Clare talks about is not a flat reflecting mirror like we have today. It would be like a very shiny frying pan. If you turn it upside down and you've polished the bottom of the Revere-ware copper pan, on the bottom there, in the middle, if you squint a little bit, you could kind of get a picture of your face there. You know, my grandmother's kitchen, you could actually see your face in the bottom of the pan. It's a round, shiny metal disc, a looking glass. Looking at this image, Clare says that this is like the life of Christ. Around the outer edge, you see the infancy. As you move in closer, you see the life of the earthly ministry. And in the very center, where you see the best reflection, that's where you see the suffering of Christ on the cross, which Clare says is the example of great charity. That's what you see. When you look at the cross, you see the ineffable charity which led him to suffer on the wood of the cross. The devotion of Francis and Clare to the cross of Christ is devotion to love for others. That is what the cross communicates. The focus is on the greatness of love rather than on the greatness of the suffering. And that is to be mirrored in Agnes as it is in Clare. Become what you contemplate. Francis himself composed what we might call a new book of Psalms, commonly called his Office of the Passion. In a kind of cut and paste operation, before this was really very easy to do, Francis took lines and words from the book of Psalms and rearranged them in order to tell a different story, but using the words that come from the Psalms. And what he does is he tells the story at the beginning of this office of the last days, the last hours of the life of Jesus, from his arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane until his death and his resurrection. He weaves together lines from the Psalms that give an emotional expression to what is going on within Jesus as he's looking out at these people who are coming toward him. It's a powerful piece of literature. Francis often spent time in meditation outdoors. He loved to go up into the mountains, particularly and into caves. And it is said that he often was found there weeping. And when asked the reason for his tears, he would say that love is not loved. It's a reference to Christ. That affective, emotional connection with the birth, the life, the sufferings of Christ, and his glorious resurrection mark Franciscan spirituality to this day. Much more than a matter of the head, it involves the heart. The deep connection of human feelings like compassion or solidarity, sadness, joy. These feelings, the heart as the point of our deepest place of encounter with Christ, and therefore with the Father whom we see when we look on the face of Jesus. There are certainly many other facets of the spirituality of Francis and Clare that we could explore, but it would take far too long. There is one, though, that I think all of you would expect in a lecture like this, and I'll mention it at least briefly. It's that sense of kinship that Francis expressed in his most famous poem, the Canticle of the Creatures, or the Canticle of Brother Sun. The lyrics themselves, in an early form of Umbrian Italian dialect, in fact, the earliest piece of Italian poetry, was composed by Francis for this canticle. And he composed a musical melody to sing the verses, though we don't have the melody anymore. In this canticle, Francis calls all creatures brother and sister, obviously meaning that they share with him a common parent. Brother Sun, Sister Moon, Brother Fire, Sister Mother Earth are related to Francis because they are all siblings of the beloved Son, the one through whom all things were made. This Christ is the firstborn of all creatures, a kind of elder brother to absolutely everything and everyone in the universe, from human beings to rocks and stars. And this beautiful song of praise was composed by Francis while he was a guest of Clare at San Damiano when he was about to be treated for a terrible eye disease. The doctor was down the road. And according to his early biographers, he was nearly blind and could not see sunlight or even candlelight without excruciating pain. So his eyes had to be covered with bandages. And this little hut in which he was staying, apparently, was overridden with mice that crawled all over him and crawled on his food. And he's in the dark, and he's blind. And it's there that he composes this great song of thanks and praise. With this cosmic view of kinship, Franciscan spirituality considers the material universe as something very good. This is not an obstacle. This world is not an obstacle in the journey to God. The created world is a gift. It's an expression of God's love. It bears the image of the beloved Son, the Word made flesh. It breaks down the barrier that some people see between God and the world, or between matter and spirit, between creator and creatures. This great Trinitarian communion of persons has come to dwell among creatures as the beloved Son becomes a creature himself, to lead all creatures, his brothers and sisters, toward their true home in the heart of God the Creator. It's a wonderful insight, and one that is translated into dozens of languages as people still sing that canticle around the world today. But it's time to end. And any talk about Franciscan spirituality must end with joy. This is a certain antidote to any kind of gloomy Christianity, which Francis identified as the religion of hypocrites. It can be found in the delight that Clare speaks about, that Francis noticed among the sisters, even when they faced hardship. Francis himself, even with the suffering in his life, found it hard to contain that joy he felt when he saw God's goodness that welled up in him. And there's no better story than this to speak about joy when you can dance in front of the Pope. Again, from the earliest biography, 2 years after his death. Once, St. Francis came to the city of Rome, and he greatly yearned to speak before the Lord Pope Honorius and the venerable cardinals. Get a picture of a very solemn group here. Lord Ugolino, he still puts up with Francis. He led the holy man before the Lord Pope and the cardinals. As he stood in the presence of so many princes of the church, Blessed Francis fearlessly began to speak. He was speaking with such fire of spirit that he could not contain himself for joy. As he brought forth the word from his mouth, he began to move his feet as if dancing, not playfully, but burning with the fire of divine love, and not provoking laughter, but moving them to tears of sorrow. Many of them were touched in their hearts. Notice that again? Touched in their hearts. Amazed. I can imagine they were amazed. What in the world is this? Amazed at the grace of God and the great determination of this man. I have something so wonderful to tell you that I have to dance it. Francis had been speaking in words. Things like my words that hover in the air for a moment like the oxygen around us. We can't see them or touch them, though we can record them. But then something happens. Francis gives his flesh to the Word. The Word becomes flesh as he begins to show in his body what he tried to say with his words. And that's when the cardinals feel it. They're not laughing. They're weeping tears of sorrow, touched in their hearts. In their sight, that Word became flesh. Francis made it happen by dancing. And this year we celebrate the 800th anniversary of that way of life that he and Clare pioneered.